Hello, and welcome to the 14th episode of the Mike McNair Revolutionary Strategy Series. Today is Tuesday, the 18th of June 2019, and I'm your host, Tom O'Brien. This week we continue our reading of Chapter 5, Communist Strategy and the Party Form. We're joined again by Sophie of Trans Revolution, Lexi of Swampside Chats, Derick Varn of Symptomatic Redness, and Dan, friend of the show. This week I have the new patrons JV, Ryan Tardif, Patrick Higgins, Ben Hanchu, and Ryan Freiberger to thank. You too can join the Patreon gang for only $5 a month and get access to the Patreon-only podcast episodes, along with other cool stuff like the right to vote on the next reading group series. When we hit 100 patrons, the Patreon-only podcast will become a fortnightly endeavour. If you'd like to comment on the show, please do so on the YouTube channel. Make sure to like, subscribe and share. And you can also join me on Facebook or Twitter too. Okay, back to the discussion. The periodic purge was also to be one of the central weapons the Bolshevik leadership promoted against corruption and bureaucratic degeneration once the party had taken power. In this character, it was, to put it mildly, wholly ineffective. Individual bureaucrats and corrupt elements might be purged, but the overall effect of the purges was to increase the power of the party bureaucracy as such over the rank and file, and therefore reduce and indeed rapidly eliminate the ability of the proletariat as a class to fight for its class interests through the Communist Party. So-called Leninist sectarians believe that splitting organizationally from the right and repeated purges will make a pure revolutionary organization. The political collapse of such sectarians into the most abject opportunism has been a repeated failure in the history of Trotskyism and Maoism. The process is going on before our eyes in the British Socialist Workers' Party.
Are in the American ISO, who just dissolved so they could help Democrats more. Also maybe a rape scandal, but it was 5 years old and no one cared until very recently, so I probably don't believe that. Funny
that the British SWP party about 5 or 6 years ago, it split over relations as well.
Actually, as a side note, not to get too much into the weeds here, those rape scandals happen within months of each other, but the ISO one only really has mattered when Haymarket Books got real rich. I would have a lot of people very mad at me for saying that, but that's an objective truth. So
yeah, I think.
How come they got so rich?
They publish a lot of Democratic Party material right now, and that endowment is tangentially related to the ISO, but since they have like Rebecca Solnit and all the like a lot of stuff around Black Lives Matter, it's come into vogue with not just even the DSA, like just straight up normal Democrats, and they have the copyrights to it. They're flush with cash. The partial takeover, the dissolution of membership does seem to have come from a grassroots kind of serious disgust at the rape scandal, but some of the leadership siding with that seems to be more related. It did seem suspiciously tied to arguing over who has control over Haymarket Books, and dissolving the party clarifies that, or dissolving the organization, the party clarifies that. So all this stuff is super icky. The history of Trotskyism is like rife with this, but Maoism to me is like the biggest example of this. The Cultural Revolution's whole purpose was to quote purge capitalist rotors and make the party more democratic. And yeah, like in the end, Deng Xiaoping's in power. Super NEP on steroids, and also the free speeches for this. Technically, it wasn't real forbidden in first time period after the Cultural Revolution. It's just the opposite of what it said it was going to do is what happened. If you look at what happened in the late 1910s and 1920s with the Soviet Union, that we shouldn't have been surprised. It's happened before.
Yeah, the term of art that I like to use for this on Swampside, the sort of psychosexual language, is tight butthole authoritarianism. People are, constitutionally trying to close up and shut everything out. And the thing about being the party of iron discipline is that you just end up a really uptight asshole.
But you know what's funny about this though? It's almost always done in the name of being more democratic. We have to suppress these elements to be more democratic, even though what we're doing is killing all formal democracy within the party.
It's also, you can't really settle these debates, especially if you have a membership policy such that you can get a huge influx of members. Like, they're just going to be reopened again eventually. The same social forces are still at play in and on your organization.
Exactly. That's a major point, Dan. That's what I was thinking when I was reading this. I wrote on the side of the page. It's like, if that's the case, you're going to have to repeatedly purge every 5-10 years when you get a big lump of new members in. It's just not feasible long-term strategy.
Conversely, a democracy of 9 people is meaningless. So, like, when you're talking about democracy, but you're purging for purity, like, you can democratically make your platform and lines with 9 people in the party because, like, you're all friends and hang out, and of course you're all going to vote together. It's so transparently problematic. If you're going to be democratic and you're constantly purging people, you don't have a real democratic base. Conversely, the social forces that you have a problem with don't go away, and anytime you have new members, you're going to have to do it again.
Screw that, Derick. If we were in a party together, I'd vote against you on everything just out of pure spite.
This is why I was a Bordigist and said to hell with democracy for years.
Yeah, because listen, we're socialists. We'll never be in a room, bigger than 10 people, so we don't need democracy. We can just kind of go with the flow. Like,
I heard an explanation of organic centralism, and that, like, it's like, when you're a group of friends and you come together and decide what movie you're going to watch, you don't like vote on it or whatever, you just make a decision. And my immediate thought was like, well, yeah, like when you have 5 friends watching a movie, you're not talking about ginormous social policy, you know what I mean, with like thousands of people or more actually implicated.
Nah, that scales up. What's the problem?
It does. I was in a cinema the other day and there was like 1,100 of us, and we had we could choose any film ever, and it was fine. The only thing that went wrong was there was 1,200 different votes, so we had to sit down and watch 1,200 different films in a row. We're not okay though. So he's going to get into like the stuff here again about how the right always comes in and makes ultimatums, and also gets backing from. That's interesting when they get backing from the capitalist side. Because if you're a capitalist, who are you going to back? The revolutionaries or the right of the Socialist Party? He even mentions George Galloway in here. It's quite interesting reading this with what's going on in Britain at the moment. So let's just read this paragraph. As a result, the right is characterized by persistent use of ultimatums, splits, and party union, etc., bureaucratic censorship against the left. In the German SPD, this had begun well before the war, with the misuse of Engels' 1895 preface to the Civil War in France and the suppression of the first edition of Kautsky's The Road to Power. In more recent times, the British Social Democratic Party 1981 split from Labour was only the most extreme example of a routine practice of ultimatums, sabotage, etc. of the Labour and trade union right. So like they formed and they ended up merging with the Liberals. So a lot of the Liberals in England that, the Liberal Democrats, they're called now. That's why they got Democrat in the Liberal Party. That's those guys. They split from the party in 1981. I think it was when Michael Foot was in charge. Like at the moment, I don't know if you've been following Brexit, but there's been another split from the Labour Party. This group called the Tigers, the independent group. They've done exactly the same thing. They split from Corbyn's, and they've actually merged with a couple of Tories that have split from the Tory party.
Wow.
So shit's getting real.
What's fascinating to me about this is the right wingers' ultimatums for right now, I think in America are going to be called the left. Like they're giving us to drag us kicking and screaming into the Democratic Party. It's actually like it's like transparently happening again.
Well, and I think what's interesting about and different about now versus like the 1970s or even the 1980s is that things like the overall, for lack of a better term, Overton window has shifted so far to the right that, like, in the grand scheme of things, the right wing of socialism is incredibly left wing and crazy. Like, you see people freaking the fuck out about AOC and Corbyn. For those of us who are communists, we're just like, what the fuck? Like, this is what you're freaking out about? Wait till you hear what I want,
Yeah. You're scared of a little bit of Sweden?
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe they're talking about Uppsala though. That's a hell of a shithole.
Yeah, well, I mean, our Swedish contingent isn't here to talk shit about Sweden today, so you're gonna have to.
I'm only joking. I have no idea what Uppsala is like. I just made that up.
Tom and Dan are gonna have to hold down the shitting on Europe with legitimacy for us.
I got some. Do you want to hear? I was in a. Somebody was giving me some Twitter hassle today. I thought this might be. You guys might find that interesting. Somebody told me, please don't try and insult your guest this time. The Americans are always so squeamish. To which I replied, if I can't insult an American, what's the use of hosting a podcast? Tell you, that's what this podcast is all about me. It's just getting to insult Derick.
Tom, I'm offended, Tom. How dare you?
I think maybe there's this Irish shit poster in me that agrees with you, Tom, that thinks you should make fun of me and we should challenge each other to a duel every day. Like,
Every day.
Oh my god.
All right, well, let's save the dueling until after we get through McNair on the party forum.
Dueling's better than splitting. That's all I have to say.
Who wants to take this paragraph?
Could I read something before that really quick? The right represents itself as the democratic representative of the more backwards elements of the working class, ordinary working class monarchists, for example, so that it claims that even when it is in a minority in the movement, it is nonetheless entitled to a majority in its leadership or to control of what the movement says. I thought this was a very strong point that you see often in the socialist movement, that there's always a silent majority for the most sort of right-wing idea of what socialism is, the most right-wing socialist politics.
I think that's kind of a weird thing as well, because, like, if you get talking to people just like in normal language, somebody who's not even like political, and you say, oh, I think it's wrong that like rich kids should be born into wealth, they'll say, yeah, that's a bit lousy. In reality, I think people are really pretty fucking radical when you get them out of all the stereotypical language that we talk in. So that they claim that these right-wing elements are the majority, I find that hard. It really annoys me. It just annoys me.
Me too, but it's super common right now. And you have George Galloway in England, but I mean, like, we have people doing that in the United States about borders and stuff in a way. I mean, like, even Bernie Sanders, in a way that is more than a little worrying, and it really pisses me off, because not only do they claim to be speaking for the normie majority, which I don't know. I teach kids. I don't think normies are a thing. I've never met a normal person in my life. You're all weirdos.
You've never actually met me. You've never met me.
That's true, but you're an Irish person, so you're inherently weird. So,
what is normalcy in Ireland, Derick? You listen to that?
But no, in all seriousness, like this is a big movement in the United States right now. I think in a very real way, that we're seeing this tendency to, like, well, we got to give them some legitimacy, and like the monarchist or the religious or whatever, and I'm not anti-religious personally, and I'm definitely not, but I'm definitely not a monarchist, and I know a lot of people who have anxieties about these concerns, but a lot of times if you talk normally and not in left speak, people actually agree with the more radical position. But if you talk like an asshole, then they hate you.
I think you both are correct, but I think it's a little bit overstated. I think what we could say with any degree of certainty is that the general population is more liberal than they are like super socially conservative. It's more nuanced than that. That's not like true in all cases. Like, for example, I live in a small ass podunk town outside of Phoenix. I was walking my dog the other day, and I heard some like rednecks, sitting on their patio talking about like immigrants. And it wasn't even like hardcore neo-Nazi like hate speak. They were just like talking about them coming over. You know what I mean? And I think people like Angela Nagel and Bernie Sanders are not representative of the large majority of people who have even a vague sense of like working class identity. But at the same time, like, there is an element of that.
I would agree with you, Sophie, but even go so far to say it's more nuanced often than the same person. I want to talk about my family for a second. I have a family member who is super cool with Black people, immigrants, when they work with them or in their daily life, but will spout that shit constantly otherwise, which is fascinating to me. So if
No,
like
that's incredibly common. You're right. That's like how it is usually.
yeah, so like if you like take them and show them Juan down the street, they're gonna be all about helping Juan down the street. But if you talk about immigrants as an abstract category, they'll spit out whatever dumb shit they've heard yesterday. Like there's even like ideological justifications for this too. Like, you know, well, individuals are one thing, but as a group. And I find that like neither the popular discourse around this right now seems to just pretend that like not only does that not exist within the class in one way or the other, but it like often exists within the same fucking person.
And
Like-
another place you see this too, or another way you see this too, is that like in my experience with most white trash or like redneck people in the US, like there's kind of this idea that they're all like phobes, you know what I mean? And you talk to them, and oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes they're just like, I don't give a shit if you fuck a dude, or I don't give a shit if you want to be a woman. Like, they don't care. You know what I mean? They just, you know, they're not concerned with that kind of shit. I think generally speaking, I mean, it depends on where you live, but generally speaking, like the right is more libertarian and socially liberal than everyone seems to care to admit.
Who wants to give this paragraph a go?
Marxists who wish to oppose the present state rather than to manage it loyally can then only be in partial unity with the loyalist wing of the workers' movement. We can block with them on particular issues. We can and will take membership in parties and organizations they control and violate their constitutional rules and discipline in order to fight their politics. But we have to organize ourselves independently of them. That means that we need our own press, finances, leadership committees, conferences, branches, and other organizations. It does not matter whether these are formally within parties, which the right controls, formally outside of them, or part inside and part outside. This is tactics. The problem is not to purify the movement, which is illusory, but to fight the politics of class collaborationism. Now, I gotta say, when I first read this, it sounded awfully like a justification for Labor Party entryism. And I'm not even saying that's a bad thing. That's just like the first thing that came to mind when I read this.
Yeah, and given that the CPGB actually did that, I wondered
Right.
too.
So this is the bit I forgot. This is like how he squares the circle of, you know, splitting was right. He's trying to make the point that like that split is correct. And our organizations, we have to constantly argue and expose basically the collaborationism. And that's kind of what he's saying. That we have to keep ourselves somewhat separate and always bang the drum against the right of socialism. As far as I can see, and he's making the case whether you want to try and take over a party and bang it within that party. If you do that, you need to maintain your separation. Now, I don't agree with. I just simply don't. I don't see like the taking over of a Labour Party. You know, the Labour Party, say in UK, it's essentially it's not a radical party. It's of the right of social democratic parties. So I just can't see how it could possibly end up working. I just specifically to do with the critique that he's just given. So it seems weird that he would, in essence, put forward like the strategy that they tried in the like. This is not the first time it's tried in the Labour Party in the 70s, and it was a failure. What do people think about it?
I don't know. I'm honestly like mildly skeptical, honestly, which is a difficult position for me to hold because he brings up the Communist Manifesto a little bit and talks about how, like, you know, something to the effect of like communist parties are not supposed to like be separate from like, you know, the labor parties of their country or whatever. Like, in that sense, I can kind of see the justification for this, but I think in practice, it's a dangerous game. And I think you really run the risk of letting yourself be absorbed by the right wing of socialism. With that being said, I think it's also very different in the United Kingdom. And maybe, you know, I'm just an American chauvinist who is afraid of the Democrats, because I don't see the Democrats as being even remotely a labor party. But the strategic equivalent of this in the United States is to do what the DSA is doing. And I think that is a complete dead end. I almost think if you're going to do electoralism, you should either run independent or just run as a Republican who is also an open communist and just fuck with them. Like, that's almost a better strategy to me than trying to, you know, ally yourself with the Democrats.
I just want to make the basic point that a big difference is that the Democratic Party isn't really a party in the same sense as the Labour Party. There's all these sort of extra party organizations like the DCC, DCCC or whatever, that you can't get control of even if you were to somehow build a majority of support within quote-unquote Democratic voters. Like, it's not really a singular institution that you could take over, even hypothetically.
Yeah, the Democratic Party is kind of a legal fiction. It has a low bar to entry. The organizations that run it are para-congressional. Also, a lot of this stuff assumes parliamentary constitutional systems, which the U.S. is not, and so forth. But I also am going to just say the elephant in the room to me is even under Corbyn, the Labour Party has the least voting tracking with the statistical working class in the UK that it's ever had, even under Blair.
Explain that.
The voting trends are now follow American trend lines, being youthful and urban votes for Labour, and elderly and non-urban votes for Tories. And they're the only income/productivity variable that tracks to working classness is age, not your job, which means that in aggregate, the Labour voters are slightly poorer right now, but it doesn't track to like union membership or any of that. And that's new. That's only happened in the last 10 years. And that, there's been, since probably the end of Blair, there's been an Americanization of the style of politics in the UK. This is there's been Pew study after Pew study on this. I know people don't want to hear it because it shoots you, but you don't buy it.
No. Let me be clear what I mean. As in, I'm sure that it's true, but that doesn't mean that that's the trend. As in, for example, like just because the older working class people that are in the UK now vote Tory, most of them, doesn't mean that the young are going to vote Tory when they get old. It's not something extrapolable because, the days of the youth being blasted with the Tory press in the same way, they're just not exposed to it in the same way that they used to be. So like, I think that like there can be structural differences in the politics. So I don't like these things of extrapolating from age as a prediction of what somebody will do in the future because their father did it. I just think we can't do that. But so
I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying is you can't extrapolate from their class position anymore, which means
if they're poorer, you did say if they're poorer they vote Labour. So there definitely is a
if they're poorer and urban, they vote Labour.
And younger.
Yeah, and younger. It might mean Labour becomes a working class party again, but it does indicate that it isn't right now. And so unless you do this thing that all Marxists do to pretend that somehow working class is an ideological position and not a sociological one, and in which case all this is meaningless.
I'm not making that case. I'm just talking about like specifics. I have, this idea of like people always get more right wing when they get older and stuff. Well, I'm obviously someone who's gone the opposite way, and you are too, Derick.
Yeah, no, I don't think. I think I hope they're a bunch of flame throwing anarchists by the time they're 70. But maybe not anarchists, but flame throwing, I'm okay with.
just flame throwing carnies.
Flame throwing post-communizer neo-Kautsky. Yes.
Oh my God.
I'm all about walkers with Molotov cocktails just lining the walker. I'm okay with that. That's
when we were kids.
When
we were kids, we used to play this game of throwing Molotov cocktails. We'd hold it until the flame would get as close as it could to the petrol, and then we'd throw it. And the game was like whoever could hold on to it longest. It was a very dangerous game.
Wow,
I'm amazed nobody ever got actually seriously hurt.
That's like one of those games that, the dangerous new game that your kids might be playing tonight. And like, of course, in America, no kid is ever playing it. But in Ireland.
Yeah, we're like, Molotov cocktail. Let's go, boys. Let's go.
Oh, my God.
Just like Grandpa Seamus used to do.
Yeah, that makes lawn darts look really, 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 really not that impressive anymore.
What is it? Lawn dart.
You basically it's this American game in the 50s where you basically threw knives at each other's feet.
I was in a pub. I was in a pub on an island off the south of Ireland, and there was these girls. It was the wildest night I ever had in my life. They were like 17, and the pub was quite big. It was like maybe 20 meters long when you're inside of a big square one, and they were playing full pub darts. So people who were drinking and sitting down, over their heads was this dart game where there was a dartboard on the other side of the wall. They were firing darts the full length of the pub. My God, it was totally insane.
If only we had that fire in our socialist. That fire is called vodka.
Actually, on here I've got an interesting. I can't let this story go because I'll remember it again. But it was on a crazy island, and they had cars. Like, you don't have to have in England have an MOT. It's like you have to have your car standard. But when you're living on the islands in Ireland, you don't need to have car insurance. You don't need tax. You don't need anything. It's like a special privilege of the islands. Banger cars. These cars that have sometimes no seats in them, but everybody. Because it's only a tiny island, everybody knows everybody. There's only like 100 people on it. They leave the keys in the car. So like these girls, they were drunk and they got somebody's car, and they basically went and brought it for a drive. And what did they do? They drove it off the pier and into the Atlantic.
What?
And yeah, but luckily the tide was like half out. So like they were able to climb out and swim back to the shore. But the next day, there's no cop on the island. Like, so this guy wakes up and he's like, "Where's my fucking car?" And he walks down to the shop, and the pier is there, and he sees like his number plate sticking up because it landed like vertically. And he's like, "Fuck this." So he rings the cops. The cop has to come over on the ferry like about 7 hours later, and everybody knows who it was. It's these fucking crazy girls. So they're like, the cop was questioning them, and he's like saying, like, "Girls, did you steal the car?" And they're like, no, you didn't do it. And he says, "Look, girls, I know you stole the car. You might as well just admit it." And they're like, "Definitely, there's no way with us." And then he pulled out of his pocket a digital camera that he found in the car in the sea, and it was one of the girls that left it there, and it had selfies they'd taken of themselves in the car, in the sea.
Oh my God, I love them.
And they were like, "How do you explain this, girls?" And they're like, bollocks.
Can you give me their phone numbers, Tom?
I never met them again, but they were the craziest women I ever met in my fucking life.
That's waifu material.
Where have we gone? I can't remember what we're talking
about. You know what? I was just gonna say, Lexi, do you think this paragraph is how everybody from like Marxist, Leninist, and basically anti-revisionist to Sankara Jacobin can justify using this book for their strategy?
Essentially, yes, and essentially, like, this book lacks it's not exactly lacks, but just doesn't like do justice to the sort of ultra left or even like post left critique of like the way like the leftist culture or bourgeois logic or whatever fucking construct it is that draws you in, just compromises you, because it's all well and good to say that, all right, listen, I'm going to go join the Democratic Party, but I'm going to do it to fight the Democrats. I happen to know at least one organizer in the DSA that thinks of her work in the Democratic Party as destroying the Democrats. Everything in my being screams at this notion that, especially when you have the anti-political trends in, all representative governments, you have to acknowledge that the odiousness of associating yourself with this machine is great. And so you have to do your damnedest to stand apart from exactly these forces. So when McNair was talking about the difference between the manifesto and the demands in the manifesto versus Marx's program for the French Workers' Party, he also brings out the idea of a separate party. I don't know if he like always holds to this or something, but like, that's the whole point of a separate party. And however you kind of think of party, right, is to form some pole of opposition. And I don't think like forming like a tiny little party has no base makes all that much sense. But like that would be the point of orienting towards that, is that you can try to create a credible opposition.
See, I hear this around Bernie Sanders, and this is where the American situation is really different than the UK one. The nature of the executive of the Democratic Party. Let's say for a miracle, like Bernie wins, and he even makes Mike Gravel his vice president. Like we're in crazy world now, and that happens, and the Democrats sweep everything but judiciary. When I hear a lot of these people also talk about the need for the abolishing the Senate, I actually don't know that I agree with abolishing the judiciary. I think that's nutty, but limiting the judiciary's power of view.
You have to democratize the fucking
democratizing. Yeah, but most of them don't talk about that. They talk about abolishing it. But yeah, democratizing the judiciary, et cetera, and so forth.
Abolish is just like a Smurf verb for them. I'd like to go abolish some, abolish berry pie.
Yeah, but like abolish. But but where we're putting all of our strategic money, I mean, money, actually, literally money too, right now. If they won, they couldn't do any of that. Not a single point on their platform is a position that they're investing all of their time in supporting would do the things that even meet the minimum program that the DSA wants. Bernie can't even do by himself Medicare for all. Not possible. You can't do that from the executive. Now, that's not the case of a prime minister from a party.
He could do it. Bernie could do it if he had the Senate and the House with him, couldn't he?
Yeah, but he's not going to have the Senate. And,
you won't have it this time.
Even if it's primarily Democratic, he's not going to have the ability to get Medicare for all. It's just not going to happen.
I know that, but like if you think about politics as long term, so you try and do it. Maybe you won't get it this time. Maybe you push and you get it. Like
right. I think you're knocking on something interesting, and it's the exact opposite of the way that American socialists actually do politics. But the McNairist thing that you could do in America is elect legislatures who like don't have to execute capitalism, right? And that would be the thing to do, not to do what American socialists actually do.
Which is to back an executive candidate.
I think the long-term thing that you brought up, Tom, is really interesting because I think the point of backing Bernie Sanders is that they see it as a shortcut, basically. It's a way to get around having to do the long-term stuff. So I think they actually have sort of the opposite view of doing this as a long-term way to build up socialism.
I don't even problem of the right. Like it's the problem of wanting like abandoning a strategy of patience and saying we need to do something now. Bernie Sanders, you know what I mean?
But I think it's even worse than that in America. As in, like at the moment, Bernie came from nowhere, and they're just like, "Fuck it, let's ride a Bernie." Like the people don't think he's going to get the Senate and the House to get it through, but they just going, "He's a way of voicing something," and I think that's at the level of it gets to in America at the moment. That's just a function of the weakness of things. What I kind of like from this paragraph, I've just been thinking about it here while you've been chatting, is like, I think it needs an extra. I think the book might need an extra paragraph or an extra section on like the idea of like a commie. We have a parasite strategy where if you take the Labour, what's happening in Labour or what's happening in the Democratic Party, what you should be, if you're going to be serious about it, you should be knowing there's going to be split in the future, and you should push it, and you can parasite and get the more radical view into the mainstream, and then there's your split. At the moment, in like say America, there is no point in being a small communist party in this little place or that little place. It won't have an effect. But let's say you parasited the Democratic Party and you took 30, 40, 50% of the party with you. That's a reasonable long-term strategy to implement now.
It is reasonable on paper. It is, but culturally speaking, for some reason, the people that do enter the Democratic Party, no matter how oppositional they conceive of themselves to be, cannot bring themselves to actually walk the walk and perform as oppositional agents. And the way that you can get on the right, I agree with that. The right to do that. Mormons can block to vote in a certain way that leftists can't for some reason.
Has anybody explicitly make that case for a parasitic strategy?
Every DSA person who's come on my show has been asked the following question: when are you willing to split the Democratic Party? And I have never, ever gotten a real answer to that. Like, what I mean is that if you want us to enter this, you know that we are going to have to declare war on the right wing of the Democratic Party, and in a real sense. And if you look at the position that they're always in, I'm going to give you an example of this from America right now. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez got a lot of shit for saying she would have to back Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House because all the people who were running against Pelosi were to the right of her. And guess what? She was right. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was right about that. But what I pointed out to the people who were defending her, and I wasn't coming down on her, but I was like, you're going to always be in that situation because the right wing is actually more willing to take the risk because structurally, if they lose, they can run to the Republicans, and the left has nowhere to run to, period.
They should run to the fucking Republicans and fuck them up. Look, I've
actually advocated that. I've said that people thought I'm insane for saying that, but I was like, no, you got to fuck up both parties. Like,
look,
how else are we gonna do that?
But seriously, like Derick, let's take this. I'm deadly serious with this point. Like I've thought about it before. It's just like, you read the book and it brings back the ideas. Like if you ask like a politician, when are you going to split with the thing? They never say, oh, I'll do it at this point. They can't say it. But that doesn't mean that the strategists and the theorists and whoever, like if it's you or whoever it is, like those, for example, Derick, I haven't heard those ones because do you know why? They're all on the goddamn Patreon pay feed. So nobody hears it.
Sorry.
But you know what I mean?
520 people hear it, but yes, you're right. No,
you know what I mean? So what I'm trying to say is it's not something that I hear as a strategy. I don't hear anybody like Novara Media or any of these people or, Social Democrat like Chapo or anybody saying, we got to go there and push it. And then if it comes to it, then we're going to smash it open and we're going to take 50% of the party with us. And then we're away, lads. Then we're away. We're actually going to...
Craftsman on Chapo actually admitted that was kind of his goal once when he was drunk. But he was immediately... Even on Chapo's panel was like looked at in horror, which tells you and when I say that, because I'm not talking to politicians. I mean, this is the thing. Like when I say this to people, they're like, yeah, sure, yeah. When are you going to do it?
The problem is that when you say it, do you know what you sound like? A fucking trot. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
it's true. I'm not joking.
Here's like an obvious issue that's not really being addressed, and that there is a cultural and social psychological component to this, to where, see, this is why I think even trying to split the Democrats now is a dead-end strategy. It's not. It has to do with the culture around the DSA and this as a strategy. They will never, ever really advocate for a split from the Democratic Party because they are right-wing socialists. And Lexi and I have even talked a little bit about like how we would do this as like communists. And Lexi suggested, if you're in a blue state, you run as a troll Republican, and if you're in a red state, you run as a troll Democrat. I don't think even I live in a red state. I don't think even in a red state, a Republican state, it would make sense to run as a troll Democrat. And the reason for that is because the DSA has spoiled the strategy. Like the whole thing with it is just to let yourself be absorbed and ally yourself with the national bourgeoisie. There's no way around that now. And I think if you're going to run as either major party, just fuck with the Republicans. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, so there's another unironically call yourself a Marxist Lincolnist. Like, fuck it. Like, why? And here's the thing too. Like, instead of this paragraph of McNair, I think honestly, the anti-politics people have a better take on this. We shouldn't be trying to be like polite politicians and work with the system or whatever to get menial reforms that will never happen. What we should do is get people in, whether they're independent or they're running as troll Republicans or whatever, just get them in and just get them railing against Congress like the early SPD did. Just get them screaming at them about fucking imperialism. There was an indigenous woman who was recently, I can't remember her name, but she was elected in the Democratic Party as one of the kind of lefty social democratic people. And she said, impeach the motherfucker. And she said the F word as a politician. I think we need to do that, but on steroids. We need to do that and be like, impeach all you motherfuckers. You all fucking suck, and you're going to fucking let the world drown rather than do something about it. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, we need to tap into that pissed off anti-political mood right now. There's a lot of things that the anti-politics people say that I don't agree with, but they have a better take on this strategy than I think McNair has right here.
I guess, full disclosure, I'm a DSA member. I used to be in the Refoundation caucus when it existed. Reluctant DSA member, I guess you could say. And from my perspective, the time to do the split was 2 years ago. And now that there's all this media attention and growth, even the people in the caucus that used to at least formally say that we should split and build a workers' party, which is Momentum and Spring and all of them, the incentives have now shifted that they call that, I think the quote is, fruitless and sectarian. So, like, I don't want to be too determinist, but I think the time has passed for there to be a real split. Like, I think the subsumption is just kind of what is going to happen.
Well, yeah. The other thing about the DSA is it's not a party, and it's not structured like a party. There's no the national is barely accountable to the locals, and the locals are barely accountable to the national, and thus there's no real democratic mechanism on all of it. And honestly, to kind of bring it in, the only way the DSA grows is that it can't function that way. And I know that sounds insane, but all these groups, if they were accountable to each other, would hate each other immediately and would not tolerate each other. And so, like, the elephant in the room to me about this strategy is, to me, this chapter points out it's never worked. This has been attempted.
Yeah, well, look, here, the thing is, like, I know Dan might think they should have split before. Do you know, you want to ask me the time you should do a split would be, let's say if Bernie won and he's the president, then you fucking split. You split at point of maximum power and impact. If you split like 2 years ago, it'll just wishy-washy, and you'll end up like just another small split in the end. Like, the thing is, like, I think honestly,
because like there is some like independent quote political energy that's being routed into these electoral efforts. Well,
nowhere near enough.
But the cost of associating yourself with the Democratic Party has alienated a lot of the proletariat that may have been involved otherwise. It's hard to calculate the negative value, the political stink of throwing yourself into the swamp. Like, look, you can barely calculate it.
I don't think someone like Bernie has a big stink on him, and I think like lots of others do. But I just thinking, like, when you do a split like that, like, the instinct of all of us is to split early, and that's just it's like the thing of strategy of patience. You got to have like a split of patience strategy too. Look, I just think, to be honest with you, I think this paragraph is something that McNair doesn't deal with in this book at all. And to be honest with you, if anything good comes out of our discussions on this book, maybe an actual formalization of something like this idea of parasitism as a strategy, because I think that's a very viable strategy, to be honest with you. Maybe it has to be something that's implemented correctly and not just get in and then just like go at the first time, but like literally a long-term strategy, and then break and destroy. That's how you could destroy the Democratic Party.
You would have to be accountable to a different party, essentially.
The thing is, it doesn't have to be a formal unity of party. It could literally be that the strategy is out there and everybody understands it.
So
and
in
loads
America,
of people are talk about it.
In America, this has happened one time in our history, and it was not actually it was at a point of maximum impact, but it
Lincoln.
was not. Yeah, exactly. But it was not. It wasn't planned. It was a collapse and an opportunistic split, with Lincoln representing the true center and the radical Republicans representing the left. And you're completely right. And it worked because it happened at a time of war, where the norms of American politics were also frozen and the Constitution was actually suspended. And that is not something anyone can talk like. I'm going to be honest with you. When I hear all these minimum programs in Jacobin, when they talk about getting rid of the Senate or whatever, I'm always like, you realize you can't do that in America democratically. You can't.
Well, you can. You can do it with a referendum.
No, you can't.
You
No, you
can't.
cannot.
You can. You can change the.
No.
You can change the constitution.
You literally cannot.
pretty-
You have to. The only way you can change the constitution is through an amendment. You can't do
Yeah.
it through a referendum.
But like, how do you do an amendment? It goes to the people, doesn't it?
No, it goes
it goes to the states.
2/3.
It goes to
Okay,
the
yeah.
two-thirds majority of the state representations, which is set up by the parties, which is set up by the parties in many states in their constitution, which literally names the parties that are legitimate to do it. I mean, like, and our constitution, its existence only came about through illegality. And I don't mean like a bailing from the British. Our own constitutional convention was illegal.
Well, look, what's the Revolutions podcast guy called?
Mike Duncan.
Mike Duncan.
I've listened to all of them.
Mike Duncan won, and he says, like, in the rock paper scissors of revolutionary power, an armed force will always beat the constitution. You know, that's at the stage where you get those things turned over. Look,
yeah, but trying to talk a bunch of leftists to going into the army, like I've been trying.
even then, like, this gets back to the earlier problem that we were talking about how the Marxist concept of like getting into parliament and having enough seats to form a government without any bourgeois party, and then enacting your minimum program and thus triggering a civil war. That will never ever happen in the United States.
That's rubbish. Look, the thing is, we can't say things will never happen, but the thing is, we're an awful long way from things happening. That's all you can do. Like if you asked them, what was the thing? Did Lenin think a communist revolution was possible in 1916 or something? He thought it wouldn't happen for like what? What did he say? Like, there was some quote like he thought it wouldn't happen for 50 years.
Yeah,
or something.
yeah, and then it did.
You know,
it was great.
Yeah,
so
but we're talking. I think
Also
the Democratic Party is not where that wellspring is going to come from.
And also the glaring operation in all this with 1916 is if you know what, I don't think McNair addressed this either. If the SPD had acted principally, World War I would have never happened, and thus the Bolsheviks would have never came to power. End of discussion. They could not have defeated the Tsarist army with even a field army without basically the collapse brought on by World War I. That's what defeatism kind of meant. So this whole thing is based off a series of unfortunate events, which no one wanted. And the only reason they won was by getting what they did not want. Like, if you think about what that actually means, this whole book becomes kind of laughable.
Let's calm down here. Look, that's going to always be the way. There's always... Look, go watch The Godfather. If he hadn't gone, like, by the toll road, he would have been grand. You know...
I mean, Derick, I think he does, like, he's addressing a lot of like the fundamental dynamics behind these things, but he's not taking it to their logical, frankly, Menshevik conclusions.
Yeah, like, no, I agree. I mean, like, I think McNair's onto something, but I'm very frustrated that it, like, you still have to do this doublespeak about the meaning of everything, even in this. Like, his conclusions, you have to hold two almost opposite opinions of the same time. Like the whole Lenin was wrong, but he wasn't, but he was, but he wasn't.
Well, I think that kind of like isolating certain premises and arguing for those on their own merits is the only way that you can take these things apart. And so, like, I don't know. I really appreciate that part of the book. And the problem is that, you know, I guess it's in one of these nuances here, and the devil is in the details, that one of these sub-arguments has a problem. We need to do the same thing, locate this premise.
Here's the issue, and I actually do think this is serious, and not just with McNair. This is something Marxism has been struggling with since the Brumaire. That whole line of, we do not make our own history by our own means, except when we do it except we'll be able to do it in the future collectively through means of communism. That so much of this is stochastic. And the only way strategically, like, I'm reading other books on strategy right now that kind of contrast with this. The only way to do that is to account for the stochasticity of any given situation. But that means having a strategy, one singular strategy, or saying you can know what a Marxist center even is a priori, seems impossible. when you really take that seriously, if you take that whole material condition things to its logical conclusion, you can't have one form that's going to fit everything. And McNair's trying to say that, but also still trying to say there's one strategy.
Yeah, the strategy of patience doesn't give you basically a directive as to how to act within your specific country. I think if you ask him, he's really thinking in terms of like the countries he's most familiar with. It's Eurocentric, perhaps, but maybe not. Maybe not.
I mean, it wouldn't even be Eurocentric. It would be Britocentric, right? Britocentric, not Anglocentric.
Oh yeah, my bad. Sorry, you look alike.
Not for long.
Oh,
it'll soon be Anglo-centric after Brexit is finished.
Oh yeah, let's hope. I mean, let's not hope. I mean, I don't know how to feel about that.
I guess ultimately, Thomas right. I shouldn't say never ever happen, right? Like anything's possible, but I think kind of getting at what Lexi and Derick were just talking about, this strategy outlined in this book has a really difficult time mapping out onto United States politics. And I'm not simply just trying to be ethnocentric here or whatever. Like, I'm trying to think about, like, as a communist, what should I do where I live? I don't think the strategy outlined in this book is very feasible. It doesn't mean that there isn't insights we can't take from it. But I think to do the kind of enacting the democratic mandate of enacting a minimum program in the United States, what that would require would already require we overturn a lot of the rules about two-party system and the way the government works to begin with. And if we're getting to that point of political power where you can change rules that much, it doesn't make sense to continue to try to win electoral gains with a communist party or whatever, or a communist group infiltrating these parties. Like, does that make sense? I don't know if I'm like really doing this justice, but I think like in order to get these kind of amendments that we were talking about earlier or whatever, like it's just such a long shot. And I think realistically how it's probably going to play out in the United States is that people are just going to get fucking sick. Like, and I'm not just saying this as like a left-wing strategy of like waiting for like the magic, riot, insurrection, or the magic like mass strike or whatever like that. But I think like as political and economic forces and these contradictions come to fruition more and more, people are just going to get fed up and they're going to start fucking throwing rocks at shit. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. I know it's not really the Marxist center strategy or whatever, but I think what the insight we can gain from this is that these kind of movements and insurrections peter out without something for them to plug into, is what my take home.
So my take on this is similar, and my historical truth of this is actually, my historical examples are all three of the major communist revolutions. They all happen at the end of wars where things have collapsed for other reasons. And that means that we have to really think about what that means. And I'm not a catastrophist. I am not an accelerationist. I am none of these things. So I am not saying this as a strategy, but I think we really have to look at what that means. And I think this book starts to, honestly, because it breaks down things in a historical, like, this is still my favorite book on communist history and strategy. I just don't know that A, that applies in America, and B, that if I really look at the history, that we're actually isolating the right factors and talking about what went wrong. Because some of the stuff, or what went right even, because a lot of the stuff you have to deal with was stuff that the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks and whoever had no control over. They had to be in the right position to take advantage of that. But what that position looks like from country to country, I'm not sure. Like, it didn't look the same. I mean, honestly, it didn't look the same. And I'm not even sure that I think the Chinese Revolution was a true communist revolution or anything, but it didn't look the same in the Soviet Union or as it did in China. In fact, like, one of the reasons why China was so frustrated in Mao's relationship to Stalin is so weird is that the advice they kept on giving them from the Soviet experience kept on getting them killed, and they just quit listening to them. And that tension led to the Sino-Soviet split. That's not dealt with in this book at all. Like, we're just looking at Russia. And I mean, I know why, but I come away feeling like all this does is give me an orientation to think strategically and think long term, but not any content as to what that really means.
Yeah, but that's a major improvement from most of the stuff we have. One thing I'd like to say before,
Yes.
like to kind of soothe Sophie's negativity about America, like just from the Irish case, in 1798 there was a massive rebellion, United Irishmen and Wolfe Tone, and they got absolutely slaughtered by the British, and it was an all-time low. And then in 1840s there was a massive famine where half the fucking country died or left. And the Irish Republican cause was on its ass, and people thought it was dead. And then, holy God, 70, 80 years later, it rose and it came true, and they got rid of the British. You couldn't, I'd say if you talked to somebody in 1850, it would have been inconceivable, like truly inconceivable, that they could have got rid of the biggest empire in the world, and they just killed half the people or moved half the people out. So things really change. And the one thing I would say about Derick as well is that with this idea of war and stuff, well, I think it is in the crisis. It doesn't have to be a war. It could be, like, for example, if it was in England right now and there actually was a kind of a commie left in the middle of Brexit, I guarantee you it would have shifted. It would have.
Oh no, yeah, I agree with you.
You know, it would have shifted, and it's not necessarily. It probably just needs. It doesn't have to be like a war crisis. Maybe that was the 20th century version of it, but like there can be simple ass political crises. Like it could have been in Ireland the 2008 financial crises. You know, the reason I'm into Marx and all that is because of that. You know, and that's how things happen. Like, so we can't be just like, you know, crises come along, they go. Like, you know, in the UK, they've had this crisis. You know, they had the IMF in the 70s, they had World War II in the 40s, you know, World War One in the 1910s, you know, probably like the French Revolution is, you know, in 1871 and in 1848.
Things can't happen. But like, you know, is this a strategy that's going to get us there?
The thing is, like, if we don't have patience, we'll never even get to the place where you could even do it. If we don't have a strategy of building up numbers, and if we don't actually try and build a line.
Yeah, I
agree.
Yeah. But is the way to do that in the United States to build up a completely independent poll from the Democratic Party?
I mean, honestly, that's a question for me.
Honestly, at the moment, I think it's so far from even being a thing. Because, like, if you were to split right now and get the radical elements of the DSA off and do it that way right now, or whatever, it'll just be another meaningless split.
Let's talk about Marxist Center, right? Like, you know, that's the
what's that going to be?
So again, the anti-politics people, they sometimes make an abstraction called politics, which includes things that I think are only sort of nominally called politics, like complaining online about politics and stuff like that. Like, there's an entire political culture around the existing parties that, if given the opportunity, will take a lot of the, the obsessions of the of an extreme wing of the sort of politically oriented sort of stratum or something, and harden those into something even less popular than reformism. So
yeah, I was about to say, like, there's an abstentionist wing of the Marxist Center in the United States, and it's already taking a very strange. Well, not strange. I mean, it's just taking it is becoming very little different than the Marxist-Leninist parties that it's supposedly.
Quelle surprise. But anyway, here, look, we're going late. I think it's been a really interesting discussion, to be honest.
Oh, yeah.
Like, honestly,
yeah, for sure.
God, I think there's loads of good stuff in this Mike McNair, but I think, like, there's something in that idea of, certainly in the American context and in the Labour Party British context, where you got first past the post in England, not proportional representation, or in America where it's a closed thing. You're kind of, I think the parasite thing is probably something that would be interesting for people to formalize and actually discuss. You know, so maybe that's something we can bring forward in the Emancipation Network as a thing we could work on.
There actually was a group that tried to formalize that politics. The ISO is really into it. They called it the Dirty Break.
Yeah, and that's actually what's in my mind is the ISO. They had that. They also were impossibilists, even though they would deny that. But they thought that the Dirty Break would be based because the reforms that they want in their transitional program are impossible, and so, you know, it will. And I would go ape crap about that, because that's explicitly something Marx said not to do. They wouldn't call themselves that, but that the transitional program where you say we're agitating for these reforms because they will fail, and then that'll radicalize the working class. That is the French, the French Marxist Party's impossibilism. That's what that's called. They advocate.
That's not what I'm advocating for, though.
I know, and that's only part of what they're doing. They also had the dirty break parasite strategy. But guess what? As of this week, what side of them exists and what side doesn't?
A bunch of them are entering the DSA.
yeah, I know. So that'll be real fun. A lot of them already had, but I mean, like, also as a side note, that group was way smaller than I thought. I thought it was like 5,000 people, and it was apparently only 500 because they never published their numbers till like right now. But like you're going to see this advocated, but what it has done so far is they basically have been liquidated into what they thought they were going to break. It's from scandals and legit nasty stuff that was done wrong. I don't want to like say that the reason why the ISO was dissolved is invalid, but look at where they're at.
I just want that Haymarket dollar. Give me that Haymarket dollar.
Well, Haymarket made that one of the most sustainable socialist organizations that was like, just say no to the Democrats. Even maybe they're inconsistent about it, but they would talk about that kind of thing all the time. And during the Sanders, years, but I guess probably
before then more.
Yeah, but there was a period where they were putting forward hey, look, we have to be independent from the Democrats. We can't like fall for this. Like they were just doing their Robotrot thing, but broken clock twice a day. Like
right. And then they published Rebecca Solnit and people like that because it was a way to get money in. I mean, I don't think it was nefarious. I think it was just a way like, this person's
it was
progressive.
smart.
It's a way to get. But Solnit opposed Bernie. Like, I mean, she was a Clintonite, and so like that's where we're at. That anyway.
This show is also a member of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast and research collective. Make sure to check out our network sister podcasts, General Intellect Unit and Swampside Chats. On this episode, you heard the theme tune The Order of the Pharaonic Jesters and The Night of the Purple Moon by Sun Ra and his orchestra. Thank you for listening. Please join me for the next episode of From Alpha to Omega.